Hello, and welcome to F1 Into the Barrier with me, George Close, reviewing the Canadian Grand Prix. Ladies and gentlemen, we had a cracking weekend, a sprint weekend, so much going on. The championship is fascinating. We've had revivals from Lewis Hamilton. We had a pretty revived Red Bull, I say, as well. We've got a very, very interesting midfield battle as well developing between Williams, Racing Bulls, and maybe Carlos Sainz. And why isn't Alex Albon in that too? Well, we're going to discuss that in today's episode. And I think there's so much going on this weekend, we're going to do it by theme. So the first theme, George Russell versus Kimi Antonelli. And what does Toto Wolff do in this championship battle, which is now separated by 47 points with Kimi Antonelli asserting some dominance, taking his fourth win in a row. They've been banging on about this very boring stat that he's the first ever driver to take his first 4 consecutive wins in a row from his first win. Some ridiculous stat, doesn't mean an awful lot. But what it is showing is that Kimi Antonelli is proving the doubters wrong, including me. He is capable of mounting this championship challenge, and he's very quick. He's very quick, but he's prone to some mistakes. And as we saw, so is George Russell. So in quali, they were very close. But George Russell, you have to say, until the DNF, he had the upper hand over the weekend. He managed to beat Antonelli by 0.068 seconds in sprint race quali. In the sprint race itself, yes, he raced hard. Kimi did some complaining on the radio. That's going to be a theme, I think, in more than one race this year. But ultimately, he was hard, but racing's hard. They're going for a championship. I don't think George did anything outrageous. He shut the door, and yes, Antonelli did have that good lunge around the outside. Was he far enough along? It depends at what point you want to take the freeze frame. But I think overall it was fair. Mercedes didn't want to do anything about it. And sounding from the debrief, they were content with that style of racing. Now, they do get very close over the weekend. But listen, George comes out on top. He's got the momentum. Going into quali, again, the same gap to Antonelli, 0.068 seconds. Which is incredible. And George, he puts that in on the very last lap. Because odd, wasn't it, quali? Because it looked like they had all gone and there wasn't going to be another round of final laps. But there were. And not everyone did. But those final laps, well, it managed to take George Russell to an ecstatic pole. You could see how much it meant to him. And going into the race, George gets a very bad start. Lando gets the quick getaway on the intermediate tyres that will ultimately they had to bin very quickly, but it did help with the launch. When they're then trading, I mean, it's amazing how close these cars can follow. And I thought it was just really good racing. Yes, there's the moment where George takes Kimi on the outside and Kimi locks up, nearly goes into the back of him, but he didn't. Yes, they had some other close moments, but they didn't touch. And yet, listen, eventually they're going to touch the season and there's going to be something. Either both or one of them will go out. We saw it last year. It happens. They're two racers in the same car who are at very similar levels in terms of one lap pace at the moment. Now, there's still a lot of this season to go. There's 17 races left. We're coming into the European season, and that's where Kimi Antonelli really struggled last year. So it will be interesting to see if you can carry that form. The other thing I'll note is Monaco's a bit of a weird track this year. The Ferrari's going to do quite well there, given their engine setup. McLaren going to have more to say. There's plenty more. But between those two, people are saying, oh, George is more consistent, but Kimi's faster. I honestly think they're about as quick as each other at the moment. They seem to have upper hands on the weekend. I mean, George Russell won last year from pole. He's very good at Canada. People forget how good George is. I met another person who didn't understand why I liked George Russell. They liked Lewis. They weren't a Max fan. They liked the other Brits, but they just think he's Woody from Toy Story. I don't think people get his sense of humour, fine, but that doesn't mean he's not a good racing driver. He is very good. I think he probably would have won yesterday had it not been for the engine, because I think in that wheel twist, he's still, listen, he had the lockup. Lots of people had lockups going into the hairpin, but he had the lockup. Kimi got him back. They were trading, but it felt to me just the natural momentum. And when it happened as well, and the pit stops would have been coming soon after, it felt to me that George had the slight upper hand. But who knows? The point is he didn't get the upper hand. He's now 47 points adrift of his teammate. And that's a big gap. But there's a long way to go. And if we learn anything from last season is don't focus too much on these gaps at this point. It's very likely that Kimi Antonelli, given how close they're coming, is going to have his own DNF at this point in the season. The question is, who will it be with? If it's with George and takes George out, it's obviously doesn't matter. But if it's with someone else, well, championships back on the cards. The next theme for you, though, is Ferrari versus Red Bull. You saw across qualifying that Lewis was outperforming Charles. Charles he was a couple of tenths behind Lewis, but they seemed to both be ahead of the two Red Bulls. Max wasn't very happy with his setup, was really unhappy in the sprint. Hadjar was getting close. I mean, it's the closest he's been to Verstappen in qualifying. I think he was within a tenth or just outside of a tenth in main qualifying. So positive for him. He wasn't that happy with his lap. But it seemed that the Ferraris over one lap pace, maybe with getting that tyre temperature right, had the upper hand. Comes to the race. Yes, the pack shuffles at the beginning. Suddenly we lost the McLarens because of their own idiocy, but we'll talk about that in a bit. Max definitely had the quicker car on the first stint on the softs. And Lewis fought him for a while, but ultimately you could just see the pace of Max. And then Lewis did a lock-up and actually dropped about 5 seconds behind Max when it came to the pit stop. Leclerc was having a bad day, but he also got stung by the double stack. So he was within touching distance of about 5 seconds. He then ends up about 11 seconds. And to be honest, it did actually look like Max had put enough of a gap to Lewis to settle the conversation. Then Lewis doing a bit of Lewis magic. I think the Ferrari being better on the soft managed to put in a really impressive stint where he was just doing that thing where he just put in lap after lap after lap, chipping away. We've seen him do that many times in his career. But he gets to Max, and Max is a difficult guy to pass. I've been very critical of his defending over time, but it was interesting. Max was asking about the gap to Charles behind Lewis because I think he ultimately felt that Lewis might get him. But it's just the drive, wasn't it? It was very interesting. And Lewis could gain that 3 tenths in the corners, but on the straight, he just couldn't do it. And they spoke about it in the commentary. Lewis had to rethink where he was going to get the pass done. And afterwards, he was talking about how hard it is to be thinking about the energy deployment over the lap. But eventually he got it right, and it was a cracking overtake round the outside. Thought Max was very fair and manages to move into P2 at that point after George had the DNF. And I mean, without the McLaren cock-up, McLarens do seem to have a bid over both Ferrari and Red Bull at the moment, so they may not have got the podiums. But it's interesting. Red Bull have definitely made progress. There's a lot of compliments for the Ferrari chassis at the moment. They crucially want these engine development upgrades because of where their engine is in power. But it's all come now as part of the deal on whether or not they move from a 56-44 engine split, as electrical energy versus combustion engine energy, to the 60-40 next year. Listen, I think they're going to get that through, but they just need to go through and make sure everyone's happy, everyone's bought in, and Ferrari definitely want to spend those points so that going into the second half of the season, they feel like they can fight for wins, because at the moment, as long as there's a Mercedes-powered McLaren or Mercedes, it doesn't look like they're going to be able to do it. The exception being Monaco, and the exception being, of course, any other wet races we have. But the person we've not spoken about is Isack Hadjar, who had actually one of his best race results, finishing 5th, inflated because of the McLarens and for George also not finishing. But he had a bit of a nightmare. I mean, the moving under braking, he apologised for, was poor. It's tricky with the electrical energy that drivers have spoken about this, sometimes judging, but he did 2 lots of double move. And then he also didn't slow down during a yellow flag. So he had the 10-second penalty, the drive-through penalty, and still managed to finish in 5th. Just shows you the gap at the moment to these other teams behind, which is quite colossal. My final little things I pick up, you had an unhappy Charles, put it on his own performance post-race, but some friction there with the engineer. Very Ferrari to just start saying the lap time of the other driver in front. Incredibly unhelpful. And yeah, very, very Ferrari. Now, talking about that very large time gap behind Isack Hadjar, we have a very interesting driver and constructor championship battle unfolding in the midfield teams. And the lead midfield teams are Alpine. They're new Mercedes-powered Alpine, and they've got an invigorated Colapinto who looked a little bit iffy coming into the season. He's on fire. We have Pierre Gasly, who interestingly is still actually ahead of Colapinto on points. Come to that in a second. We've got Oliver Behrman in the Haas. Haas didn't have a great weekend. Ocon, in particular, not having a great weekend. They were buoyed, actually, after Miami because they had some upgrades, but they really couldn't translate it into this weekend and were finding themselves way out in qualifying across the weekend and didn't really manage to make a dent in the race. We then have the Racing Bulls. Now, Lindblad, unfortunately, he's the reason we had that triple formation lap. He'd had a pretty good weekend, but obviously puts no points on the table. And Liam Lawson, who after last year being demoted back to Racing Bulls, putting in a pretty solid effort. And these guys, along with Carlos Sainz from Williams, again, Williams making improvements, but they're probably not true in that conversation. Let's go through this. So Pierre Gasly's on 20 points. Oliver Behrman's on 18 points. Liam Lawson's on 16 points. Franco Colapinto's on 15 points. Isack Hadjar, okay, he's going to be in around there in 14 points, but let's remove him from that conversation. And then dropping back, Carlos Sainz on 6th and Lindblad's on 5. Now, Lindblad's new in. He's not going to be outperforming Liam Lawson this year, but there's little signs there. Carlos Sainz and the Williams. Williams' car's been too heavy. Yes, they've made some momentum. They had the opportunity to maybe grab some points this weekend. Alex Albon has had a disastrous time. Got absolutely torpedoed by the McLaren of Oscar Piastri, didn't he? That was quite clumsy. We've not spoken much about McLaren yet. We'll finish with them. And let's talk about McLaren last. But I think the standout performer of this weekend was Colapinto, who, yeah, he's finding pace in qualifying. He's finding good speed in the race. It was often a mini screen. We didn't get to see too much of it, but you could see the battles unfolding between Gasly, Liam Lawson, Colapinto. And I think that we do need to make sure there's some emphasis and focus on that when they're broadcasting the race, because I think you're getting some great overtakes there. The rules are set up at the moment such that we can get this close following. So my plea to have a bit more coverage there. If I'm going to guess from that midfield team who I think is going to come off top at the end of the season, European season, experience, I'm going to give it to Pierre Gasly. I think Oliver Behrman and the Haas, I think they might struggle as the season goes on. I actually think Alpine might comfortably win the midfield battle. Really, it's going to be a development game. But I think advantage Alpine, then Racing Bulls. And the others behind, yes, Audi are putting in some okay performances. Aston Martin are colossally behind. We've got Cadillac colossally behind. Interesting, actually, the Perez Bottas dynamic at the moment. We can maybe talk about that in next week's episode. And let's just hope that dear Alex Albon doesn't have another Groundhog Day hitting some more groundhogs. Imagine that. You hit some groundhogs, you destroy your car, and then Oscar Piastri embraces his inner groundhog and takes out your car again. Something special for the Canadian Grand Prix. We hit a lot of groundhogs in Formula One. I'm not sure how I feel about that. Let's move on then. Talking on the McLaren theme of Oscar Piastri, let's just talk about the team and their decision to start on intermediates. A mistake. There were other teams that did it. It wasn't just them. There were 7 drivers that started intermediates. They weren't completely unique, but they were definitely unique in the front of the track. Was it a risk they needed to take? Was it a gamble? I mean, listen, it's a gamble. It didn't pay off. They probably weren't helped by the fact that there were an extra couple of formation laps. It made it even more obvious. They did have the opportunity to come in before they started. However, I know Piastri wanted to do that. I think they were doubling down and hoping there might be a safety car and then get the cheap pit stop, because that would have been the best way to lessen the damage of the mistake. There's going to have to be some data analysed to see why that call was made. Yes, it's got to be made in advance, but it was the wrong call. And when you make the wrong call in Formula One, you can look very silly and you can drop significant points to your rivals. I still think McLaren are the second best team, but if they want to put in silly strategy decisions like that, then so be it. The final little rumour you might have seen going this weekend was just some deliberate tension put between the Red Bull team boss Laurent and McLaren, which is Red Bull are alleging that GP is going to McLaren to become team principal. Andrea Sella, he said that he is stretched with time being team principal and he wants help. So maybe he's being built up to be team principal. Maybe he's going to be a co-team principal. We'll see. Maybe it's an assistant team principal role. That's very interesting. GP's been a big name within Formula One. If he wants to take on that opportunity, I think that's pretty cool. I would like to see more engineers be able to go and pursue these very limited team principal roles. And the final thing to talk about is Heikki Kovalainen doing the post-race interviews. Really cool. Heikki Kovalainen, fun fact, in 2020, I remember when I saw him, I remembered this, I read an article. There was an AI powered by AWS piece of research done for Formula One to look at the fastest ever qualifiers. And Heikki Kovalainen came out 8th, and that was because his time delta to his teammates, Lewis, Ayano Trulli as well, was very small, and they were ranked very highly. Ayrton Senna was the top. This is only the last 40 years, by the way. So your Jim Clark, ridiculous qualifying record, your Fangio is out of the picture. Anyway, I'm getting distracted in Formula One stat knowledge. Heikki Kovalainen, really cool to see. And I looked up, after Formula One, he managed to win 2016 Japanese GT series. And actually, over the last few years, he's been a triple world champion in the rally series in Japan, winning 22, 23 and 25. I just thought that was pretty cool. You can see Lewis, pretty happy to see him, an old teammate. And I like that. I would like to see more ex-drivers being given that opportunity to do the post-race interviews, because it's nice seeing Brundle, it's nice seeing DC, but they never ask super interesting, unique questions. I always like the perspective of the ex-racer. They've all got their opinion. Like Jacques Villeneuve gets a lot of attention. He rubs people up the wrong way, but he's a world champion. He's got interesting opinions. He's been damning of Lewis when he feels his form isn't there, which a lot of people don't like talking about. Montoya, he's been rubbing the Verstappens up the wrong way. So I think it's good. Keep these characters in and around Formula One. They generate conversation, they generate opinion, and then it means idiot armchair podcasters like me have something to talk about. So, Heikki Kovalainen, it was wonderful to see you. Marshals, Monaco. A prediction, I think Charles Leclerc might win. I think the small turbo on the Ferrari engine might help them. But we'll see what happens. And we'll see if the George Russell Kimi Antonelli championship battle has any more twists and turns. Thank you very much. Catch you next time.